Um, okay, got it. Um, so yeah, so this is a book that I wrote. This was my COVID project, like literally, like, I started writing intensively on this project in March of 2020. And, during the course of the first year of the pandemic, I sat in my office upstairs in my house, typing away. And so, it was good timing, let's say. But, one of the things that I've learned from the conversations that I've really had with all of you is the extent to which, you're all motivated by the same topic that basically motivates me, and that's social mobility. Like, what are the steps that we can take as a society to help take people who start off, at in lower socioeconomic status families, or even middle income families? Like, what are the things that we need to do to get those students to be able to move up the ladder? I think that that's a sort of a fundamental problem that we face in society, and something that we need to try to overcome. And there's many ways in which we can try to accomplish those goals, and higher education is one of them. So it's not uncommon to hear people talk about, how college is is an engine of social mobility. And we all know that to some extent we can accomplish that goal, that there definitely are students that we have who've gotten there through the financial aid system and have risen. To be quite honest, I probably put myself in that position, and maybe many of you do as well. But I think it's also clear to say that, like, we don't do it enough, right? That there are people who don't make it over all the hurdles that we place in front of them, that can help lift them in ways that we would like to see happen. And there's a lot of obstacles that go into that, but the thing that I want to focus on in my book, I want to focus on higher education, and in particular the pricing system. So at the end of the day, I think we can all be on board with a common goal, that what we really want from college is for everybody to go to the school that's the right fit for them, right? Not everyone's meant to go to Harvard. Not everyone should go to Harvard. Those who should. No matter where you are in the spectrum of academic achievement, there's a school that's right for you. It may not be college at all. And there's certainly people for whom college might not be the right solution, and that's great. But for some people, it's community college. For some people, it's a local public institution. Wherever it is that's the right fit for you, that would enable you to jump on the ladder the most, that's where we want you. The problem that we face is that's just not the world in which we live in. That does not happen. So there certainly there's stories, and there's research about individuals who don't go to college who probably should. Undermatching is a well-documented phenomenon at this point. Students not going to the right level of institution for them. This notion that people should go to the school that's the right fit for them is something that we just don't accomplish enough. So why don't we accomplish it? Well, as I said, there's lots of barriers. There's lots of problems in society that we face that throw up roadblocks that stop that progress. The K through 12 education system has problems. Like, you need to overcome the disadvantages of that going to an under-resourced primary school or higher secondary school, the constraints that might cause in your life. The college admissions process itself is, an incredibly complicated process. Forgetting about financial aid, just, if you have a parent who went to college, it's probably easier for you to follow in the same footsteps and using the same techniques that they did, or whatever. You get better inputs to that process. But what I want to focus on in my book is college pricing. And in some sense, the issues that we face with college pricing both have to do with its complexity and students' knowledge of the system, which is aside from actually the level of the price itself, but the level of the price itself is also something that we need to be concerned about. So in some sense, what I want to focus on in this book is thinking about, like, for people in your line of work and with my interests who would love to be able to see greater levels of social mobility, we also have to recognize that there's significant constraints in the jobs that we do. Like, what is it that needs to happen to overcome those constraints? What is it that we need to do to be able to accomplish the things that we really do care about accomplishing? I should say that the focus on this book is traditional age, college age, dependent students at four-year institutions. So basically, people spending, or cost of attendance is in the tens of thousands of dollars. And sort of that's a restriction, which I know, has some limitations. On the other hand, that's still at least half of the people going to college these days. And the reason really why I'm restricting it to that is, like, that's where the greatest cost issues are, because the cost is the greatest. So that's what the book is about. Let me spend a few minutes talking about what I'm going to do in the book to give you sort of a heads up on what's coming. I want to document the first part of in the first part of the discussion. I sort of want to document the problems that we face as a system of higher education. The colleges typically charge a lot less than the sticker price. Like, you can charge $30,000 at a public institution, $80,000 at a private institution. Those are the sticker prices. Most people don't pay that. Most schools charge most students less than that. People don't know that. So documenting the extent to which people misunderstand college pricing, that's clearly a problem. Like, that's certainly something we're going to have to overcome if we're going to make any progress in this regard. We have to be able to make it clearer to students that the sticker price that they see, the easiest number that's available for them to find, is not what they're going to have, is likely not what they're going to have to pay. The other issue, though, is that even if you overcome those information barriers, even if you are able to tell a student exactly what it is that they're likely to spend to go to college, there's also a pretty good chance, students from lower income families, there's also a pretty good chance that that's going to be too much. And so I want to be able to document that as well. So I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about why do these problems exist. And so this is sort of the, I'm going to do my best job as a professor who teaches Econ 101 to be able to convey, hopefully in English, as an economist, what we would think about the pricing system in higher education that leads to these issues. And then ultimately, what do we do about it? So, I think hopefully by the end of this discussion, we'll be able to agree that these constraints exist and that they're problems, and then how do we solve them? That's sort of what I want to do in today's talk. Okay, now the slide that has me the most nervous, because basically here I am as a professor of economics, talking to a group of financial aid professionals with a slide that's labeled how the financial aid system works, which I think in the language of my people, I think that requires a lot of chutzpah. You guys clearly understand how the financial aid system works. What I think is useful though, for this perspective, is to be able to think about the system not in sort of the nitty-gritty detail that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, but just to take a step back and think about it from a 30,000-foot level, and very much generalizing as to how the system works. And so, it's not much of a surprise that the expected family contribution is a critical component of that system. If you attend an institution that meets full need, in some sense, the expected family contribution is what the family would be expected to pay directly to the institution. Most institutions don't meet full need. Some of you do. But even if you're at a meet full need institution, it's not like that's the only price of attendance. There's still this issue of loans and work study. And so even at a meet full need institution, the net price that you pay would include both the, even if you were zero EFC, you would still have a net price that's not zero because of the loans and the work study. And then the dotted line, basically for every dollar that your EFC goes up at a meet full need institution, your net price would go up by an additional $1 until you got to the level of the cost of attendance. Like I said, most institutions don't meet full need. And for an institution that don't meet full need, there's often a level of unmet need. So even if you're 0 EFC, whatever the loans and work study is to increase your net price, you're going to be charged more money on top of that. That's labeled as unmet need. Now I have the same slope for basically as your ESC goes up by $1, the cost, your net price at a school that doesn't meet full need. And this picture goes up at $1. As you well know, it doesn't have to go up by $1. It just makes my picture look better. That's a generalization. It's also the case that the cost of attendance, like where the slope switches, is probably going to have a lower cost of attendance. It might be a public institution where it'd be considerably lower. But that's not quite right either, because there's also the issue of merit aid. And so if you're in a system at an institution where many students get merit aid, merit awards, that's going to lower typically the cost of it, the highest level of the price, the price that the full pay students would be paying. Students at lower income levels often are able to get some of the merit, but it's often substituted for part of the need-based aid. So in this picture, I have it as being completely substituted. That doesn't necessarily have to be true, but as a simplification, that's where I'm going with this. This picture, though, is important because I'm going to show you pictures a little bit later that look a lot like this in terms of its shape. And this is sort of the generalization of the financial aid system that I want to rely on. Okay, so what does college really cost? There's obviously a focus on cost of attendance. Part of the reason why there's a focus on the cost of attendance is the media loves the cost of attendance. And here's some quotes from the media. So here's, colleges have already begun to price themselves out of the American dream. Access to higher education, a hallmark of an open society, is being threatened by rising college costs. The rising costs and limited grants are narrowing higher education's ability to serve as a bridge leading low income and particularly minority youngsters into the middle class. If we go on this way for another 25 years, we won't have an affordable system of higher education. I'm sure those are all quotes completely consistent with things that many of you have seen in the past. And these are very common sentiments that you see expressed. The first one came from the New York Times. From my little Google searches, I pulled this one out, came from 2016. The one above that, 2001. The one before that, 1987. And the first one, 1973. There has to be something wrong with the way we're thinking about college costs. If we've been talking about colleges pricing themselves out of the market for 50 years, that can't be right. It would have happened already. So what is the problem? Well, of course, the problem is that the media focuses on the cost of attendance. Most people don't pay the cost of attendance. Only high-income students pay the cost of attendance. I actually have an opinion piece, which I'm trying to get published right now, talking about if we, like, a huge advantage would be just a simple name change on everybody's web page to wherever it says cost of attendance, replace it with maximum cost of attendance. Like that could help. For this group, I won't really go into the quizzing of people, but what percentage of students pay the full cost of attendance using IPEDS data? It's 13%, right? The full cost of attendance is a number that's relevant for pretty much nobody, very small fraction of students. We can do a better job by thinking about average net price. That's a statistic which is sort of making a little bit of headway. You can sort of find it in my college scorecard, for instance, would report average net price. I mean, that's better than the cost of attendance, but like that works if you're average, right? So, but nobody feels like they're average. So like at the end of the day, what we want to know is, in this relationship between EFC and net price, there's the average net price, but what we want to know is, like, if you're a low income or low EFC household, what do you have to pay? Or if you're a high EFC household, what do you have to pay? That's what we care about. In a perfect world, we would have ways to communicate to everybody what they're going to have to pay in advance so they would know and not think that $30,000 or $80,000 is the magic number. So that's basically what this last bullet point is trying to make, is that like in a perfect world, we would communicate to people, what are you going to have to pay? I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes about where these data came from. But using this exercise from colleges' net price calculators at different types of institutions, I've divided schools into different categories: public flagship, NR1. So basically, you know, UCLA and USC and Berkeley both count. You know, other public institutions, high endowment private institutions, which includes the Harvards of the world, but also schools that are, you know, Wabash College, for instance, which has, you know, $400 million endowment for 800 students. That would be in that category. And then other private institutions. I mean, basically, what this graph is representing is what the sticker prices are and what low, you know, $20,000, $37,000 income families. This is the 25th percentile of the income distribution. They're not paying anywhere near the cost of attendance. And we do a very bad job of communicating to people that that's true. So how much do people think college really costs? Everyone thinks college costs the cost of attendance. So here's a couple of surveys. The second one is from 2015. At four-year public institutions, people overstate the costs by 85%. At four-year private institutions, partly because the base is higher, because the cost of attendance is higher in the first place, people overestimate by 50%. Basically unchanged in the last 20 years. Everyone thinks the number is the cost of attendance. Separate surveys that ask students specifically about the sticker price shows that about half of them, the only number they know is the cost of attendance. If we're going to make any headway in college pricing, we have to get people off the number of the cost of attendance. It's not right. But suppose you did have full information and you did really know what college is going to cost you. Is that amount affordable? So how can we tell that? Well, basically we can do things very similar to the picture that I showed earlier. What happens if you compare families' EFC to the net prices that they're actually charged? So where do you get the net prices from? Well, this is an exercise which I know many of you have know what net price calculators look like. They are not for the faint of heart. It is not easy to get calculations out of them well, it's just not easy to get calculations out of them. Fortunately, I have at my disposal students who are willing to do lots of work for me for, you know, not huge wages. And so I hire them to use net price calculators at lots of schools. And so you have to put numbers into them. And so I generated from publicly available data what a family would look like at the 10th percentile of the income distribution, the 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentile. These are the income levels that put you at those positions among families with college-age children. I also used their basic asset data, which is available from national sources, and matched the basic asset data with income levels. So basically, you know, if you're a median person with $70,000 of income, you know, has something like, you know, for college age kids has something like, I think, $50,000 worth of net worth or something like that. And I plug that in as well. And then I may standardize all the other assumptions, the living on campus, you know, one sibling not in college, two married parents, like just a standard set of assumptions that are consistent through every institution. And I did that for 200 randomly selected institutions in those four categories from the last picture. That's where those four categories came from. So that's 1,000 estimates. You can imagine that that's just really a lot of work. I also need estimates of the expected family contribution. Thankfully, in my case, I have the ability of the knowledge that I've gained from using my intuition and from generating algorithms from my intuition, where I can compute basic use basic finances to compute expected family contributions, both an IM and an FM. I do an IM and an FM estimate, and then average them. You're probably not surprised to find out that if you do IM and FM for families that have sort of standard finances, you don't get really very different answers. So this is basically the numerical version of the picture that I showed earlier. It shows for different levels of the expected family contribution, what's the net price. And you'll also notice that I assume a $5,500 loan and a $2,500 work study package, which is not all that uncommon in the world. So a zero EFC family would have a net price of $8,000 at an institution that meets full need. This meet full need line is there as sort of a guidepost that we can use to sort of form a basis for comparison. Okay, and I'm going to do this for the dots on this line are the people with different percentiles. This is what pricing looks like at high endowment private institutions. For the most part, up through the median income families, those institutions charge net prices that are roughly consistent with meaningful need. So we can talk about whether meaningful need is an appropriate measure of affordability, but that it accomplishes that. It starts to go below the baseline meet full need estimate, and that's because merit aid starts to crop in as you move further to the right on this picture. At public flagship institutions, though, you start to see gaps. And so for the 10th and 20th percentile, 10th and 25th percentile at these institutions, you're seeing gaps of something like $4,000 or $5,000 above what people above people's meet full need level. And you're also noticing pricing system like this is much flatter than what you're seeing for high endowment private institutions. The profile is much flatter. Other public institutions, it's basically the same picture with roughly the same gap, except the cost of attendance typically is a little bit lower at those institutions, but it's a very flat profile. At other private institutions, you'll see gaps that are bigger. Right? They also tend to be flatter, but the whole profile essentially is higher than it is at the public institutions, and that this picture sort of summarizes everything. This, I would argue, is where the affordability problem comes in. So even if you knew the level of income, even if you knew for your level of income what the accurate net price would be, there's still problems of affordability there. Why does this pricing system exist? So basically, as an economist, I can take a step back and think about like, why do markets work the way they do? Why do these pricing systems exist? Even in worlds in which everybody wants low-income people to be able to go to college at affordable pricing. I would argue that there's market forces that make that very difficult. So a lot of times when you hear about public discussions of college pricing, people spend a lot of time talking about competition, and competition is good. It's not obvious to me that competition is good in these markets, because competition generates one price. If you have if you have a perfectly competitive market, everyone pays one price, high income people and low income people would pay one price. The extent to which we're able to distinguish students and ask some students to pay more than other students requires there to be not perfect competition. And in economics, the language that we use for not perfect competition is market power. Some firms, colleges, have more market power than others. The firms that have greater market power are able to charge more. Harvard's able to charge $80,000. People are willing to pay $80,000 to go to Harvard. Institutions differ in terms of their level of market power. The greater the market power you face, the greater you're able to distinguish prices between higher and lower income students. If you're charging higher income students more, you have more resources available to help subsidize lower income students. The less market power you have, and you're not able to charge higher income students more, you have less available resources to help subsidize lower income students. Endowments contribute to that as well. So obviously, if you have greater endowments, you can also help subsidize lower income students. The ability to charge higher income students more and lower income students less requires that form of market power. Public institutions sort of accentuate that because there's a price ceiling that we impose at public institutions. The state sets the cost of attendance with a goal of maintaining affordability. That goal of maintaining affordability, though, restricts revenue among higher income students. It makes it harder to subsidize the lower income students. That'd be fine if there were enough direct state support to institutions to help pay the bill for the lower income students, but there's not. You know, in a world in which the public's goal is to maintain affordable tuition for higher income students and for lower income students, you'd have the low set tuition and extensive direct subsidies to provide lower costs for lower income students. That's not the way our system works. At other private institutions, they're sort of stuck in you know, the most significant of the constraints. They don't have the market power that the Harvards of the world have to charge very high prices, partly because they're competing a lot with public institutions where the maximum cost of attendance is set by the state. So they can't charge higher income students that much. They don't have large endowments to help subsidize the lower income students. There just isn't the money there. And so at the end of the day, you know, we have a world in which this is what the pricing system looks like, because essentially pretty much everyone's facing constraints that they don't have a way to get around, except for the, you know, the highest, you know, the most elite institutions with the most market power and the greatest endowments. They can do just fine. So how do we fix this problem? You know, the information gap. So first let's focus on information. FAFSA simplification is great. It definitely will help. It's not enough because at the end of the day, FAFSA tells you your EFC. Your EFC is not what you pay the net price. We still need a way to be able to get people over the hurdle of knowing what their EFC is and what their net price is going to be, not just their EFC. We also want to maintain the, you know, so a completely simplified system just based on income, I would argue, has some problems because we still want to maintain the integrity of the financial aid system. As a professor, in my classroom, the two students in front of me, right in front of me, I know one could be paying way more than the other student. It makes me feel good if there's a reason why that's the case and not one has a better way of sheltering their assets. So I like to talk about something called the financial aid information funnel. We're used to funnels in the admissions world. Admissions people talk about funnels all the time. You start off, you want the biggest possible funnel to get as many people in the pipeline, and then you narrow. I want to do the same thing. I think the right thing to do is the same thing with financial aid information. Start off by telling people, no, you only make, you know, your family has, you know, $37,000 of income a year. You're not going to pay that much. We don't really know exactly how much you're going to pay, but it's not that much. And then start providing us more information. Give us some information on your assets. Give us more information on your assets. Ultimately, fill out the FAFSA or the CSS profile. Finally, you get a financial aid award. Keep narrowing. You give us more information, we'll give you a more precise answer. That's the kind of the funnel that I have in mind. In terms of affordability, free college gets a lot of attention. Not a huge fan of free college. You know, it does help reduce the cost for lower income families, but it's very poorly targeted and essentially mostly helps higher income families. That doesn't seem right to me. It also is exclusively focused on public institutions. You know, the not well endowed private institutions would have a very hard time in a world where public institutions get free college or free tuition. You know, my argument before about the economics, which would suggest that increasing the sticker price at public institutions would help. Let's face it, that's not happening. The same thing with increasing direct state funding to help provide, greater subsidies to lower income students. That's also a very hard sell politically. Unlikely to happen. My favorite solution to this problem is doubling the Pell Grant. Those gaps that we saw from the earlier pictures on what lower income students face, I mean, essentially doubling the Pell Grant pretty much closes those completely. People often express concern that institutions just take that money and increase their cost of attendance, and in some sense just like usurp the additional federal money. There's not very good evidence that that happens. But essentially, the argument that I would make, if it would make people feel better and make this politically more palatable, it's like if you give institutions enough money that they can meet full need, then require that they meet full need. They should be willing to make that trade-off, as long as you give them enough money so that they can do that. So in terms of the bottom line, action items, misinformation is a huge problem. We have to overcome it. I talk about the financial aid information funnel as a solution to that. And in terms of the affordability issues, I'm a big fan of doubling the Pell Grant. And at that point, I will stop and open the floor for questions. And I will stop. Well, yeah, I guess I'll stop sharing my screens there. Stop.
Well, thank you so much for Professor. That's a lot of information to digest. And I know I'm going to go back and look for that piece that you just had a picture of, the economic case for doubling the Pell Grant. I'm assuming that's something that you wrote or co-authored.
Yeah, there's a Brookings paper. So if you just Google my name, Brookings, and double Pell, it will come up. I think there's just really compelling arguments you can make for doubling the Pell Grant. I know that, in last night's State of the Union address, President Biden, I think, had three words about higher education, including increasing the Pell Grant. I saw on Inside Higher Education this morning that the proposal is $2,000, which, $2,000 is a start. $6,000 or $7,000 would be better. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. So I'm going to look for that, Professor. Thank you very much for sharing that. I don't see any questions in the chat. So, and this is not a webinar, actually, it's just a standard Zoom call. So who do we have with questions? I'll watch for you to come off mute. Feel free to show your face if you like. And let's start some questions here for the professor while we got him. There's a lot of information there we could certainly follow up on. I'll tell you right now, Professor, I could probably spend hours grilling you on some of this stuff. So I really appreciate that. But what do we have from the group before I dive into anything here? Okay, I don't see anything yet, Professor, but in case people are struggling to get off mute, or actually it looks like we got Mr. Picala. Yeah, how are you, sir? Good to see you.
I'm doing well. How's everyone?
Very good.
Hey, Phil, how's it going?
Okay, how about you? Good to see you.
I must say, we were hanging in there. This interesting weather we have kind of has emulated kind of how we're going up and downs with the pandemic and the economy. So yes, we have good days and we have a little bit of hiding in and going indoors. That's the best way to put it. But so I guess my question is, how do we get the majority of people to understand the value of doubling the Pell? Well, I think you have us that are in financial aid, and I would say it doesn't go a lot further in higher ed, and we're doing as best we can to explain it to our government relations, to our admissions people, but for the most part, we're running into people's lack of knowledge. And how do we build a great piece that is something that is short, concise, and overwhelming?
Yeah, so that's sort of related to Patrick's earlier question. So this Brookings piece that I wrote is, tries to accomplish that. I mean, in some sense, what I think the compelling argument is that people don't fully understand is the size of the gap that exists in affordability for lower income households, and that doubling the Pell is what is necessary to close that gap. You know, we spend a lot of time in public discourse. I don't want to get into free college because that's a mess, but like, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about loans, right? Well, why are students taking out so many loans? It's because like there's this gap. And, you know, we can figure out what to do about all the past loans, but we're just going to keep repeating the same problem if we don't close the gap. So, you know, how do you because that, for reasons which I'm not completely, that has captured the public's attention much more, the loan crisis. And we can talk about the right way to fix the loan crisis from people who borrowed in the past, but I'm more concerned about like preventing it from continuing in the future. And if you don't fix the cause of what's contributing to it in the future, it's just history will repeat itself, as unfortunately we see that a lot these days. You know, doubling the Pell, I think, is an important step towards helping to stop repeating history in this regard. And so I think, you know, pointing out the magnitude of the gap, what is necessary financially to close the gap, and then doing it is, I think, the argument that needs to be made.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. And I'll throw one more point in from the student loan world, which is where I spend most of my time, is I wonder if there's a way to tie in the cost of student loan defaults among Pell eligible individuals. So, you know, when you have that concern about upfront costs, you can say, well, you're going to pay upfront, or you have the potential of paying down the road if we see student loan defaults among individuals who would have received 150%, 200% of the current Pell Grant by doubling the eligibility. So, just a thought. We have two hands up, and I think Heather, yours was up first, so I won't editorialize there. Let me. I'll go on mute. Heather, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that point up, Patrick. Actually, I had a question about that, which you had answered. I am currently at Salem State University, which is a much smaller public university. I came here from a very large public university, ASU. How can smaller schools really compete and help against such large schools, especially in New England, where it's really the land of higher education? There is this push of, well, we've capped tuition, but colleges have to make that cost up somehow, so they add fees in. What do you think is a good offset for these, especially in terms of size of institution versus the added in fees where tuition may be low, but your fees can be thousands of dollars on top of that?
Yeah, so so Salem State would be included in the category of institutions that I labeled as other public. So, you know, what you see in the data for schools like yours is a very flat pricing system, right? So it's net price, so it's going to include the fees. And so you're talking about, you know, numbers like in the low 20, I don't know what yours are, but probably, you know, in the low 20s for the full cost of attendance, including all the fees. So this is the argument that I was trying to make earlier about like that you legitimately face constraints in pricing that make it very difficult to accomplish the goals you want to accomplish, right? The state tells you that you have to charge whatever, let's say 25,000, just to pick a number. You can't charge more than that. That doesn't generate enough revenue, because my guess is you're probably spending $20,000 or $25,000 per student. So you don't generate any surplus revenue from those students to be able to use to help subsidize the tuition for the lower income kids. And then you get money from the state, which conceivably could help pay for that, but they're not giving you anywhere near enough money. So, you know, the state constrains you in both dimensions. And what's disappointing, I think, about a lot of this is the part of the constraint is because in the effort to make college more affordable, they're making college more unaffordable. so this is, in some sense, like the simplest solution is, well, if we can convince state legislators that they're making mistakes, which they are, we can fix it, except that then there's competition across the states too. So that, Salem State isn't going to be able to charge more than, Vermont or New Hampshire school. And so then you run into those. That's why sort of the Pell Grant is a better solution in the sense that that's federal. And so you don't get the interstate competition. That's also going to limit the ability of the institution to help support the students that you want to help, right? I mean, like at the end of the day, I don't know. So there's, when I wrote this book, one of the goals of writing this book was to sort of like, recognize the constraints. So I don't know if any of you have read this book by Paul Light on higher education pricing, where it's just an attack essentially that like everybody in the higher education world and admissions and financial aid is out to get people and get the most money that they can and make, and naming people's names, like, this person at this institution is like a horrible person. And that's just, that's just not right. I mean, basically, I know from all of the conversations that I've had with many of you that you all want the same things that I want and everybody else wants. You just can't because there's constraints involved. There has to be a way to lessen those constraints. And I think the Pell Grant is the solution. I think that like, going to state legislators and trying to convince them is going to be a tough sell.
Thank you again, Professor, and great question, Heather. Thank you for that. And I think Gail Holt was up next. So thanks for joining us, Gail. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. And thanks, Phil, for being here. Really enjoy the conversation. I guess, so my question is about, from an affordability perspective, I appreciate the graphics and the alignment of EFC with net price, but it does seem like there's some disconnect for low income families. It seems like the net price is just not enough because it seems like their needs are actually beyond what we've published as a cost of attendance. For middle income families, it seems like the problem is about either ability or willingness to make the investment, and maybe it's readiness to do that. So I think, my question is more, is it a perception problem or a reality problem? Is that part of the communication? From a economic perspective, do we see that people are fine 15, 20 years down the road? And so it was really perception, or do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I sort of slid one through that I'm using EFC as a measure of affordability. It's not a perfect measure of affordability. And so there are, has been research that's been conducted about like, maybe that's not, for low income students, there's still gaps, even if you give them everything that they need. In some sense, I have that almost incorporated in my proposal. Doubling the Pell Grant account satisfies that as well. Usually, like the sorts of gaps that you see are in the vicinity of a couple $1,000s. Right? It's not like there's another $10,000 that's missing. And the gaps that I'm showing are like $4,000 or $5,000. And so, to double the Pell, which is still $63.95 or something, I don't know what it is for next year, but whatever, something like that, $6,500 ballpark. In some sense, that kind of incorporates that. So either the ability, so that a little bit extra provides surplus funding that could do things like provide the need that we're not really capturing very well, or perhaps even at most institutions, lower the loan burden a little bit, which also is, $5,500 to, if you took that down, that'd be great too. So, that last little bit definitely is an issue and something that we need to keep in mind. And I think that, we want to address that.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the question. We have another one here from Robert Weinerman. So Maylene, you'll be up next there, and I see you, Kathy, as well. But Robert couldn't pose it, might not be in a place he could get off mute. So the question is, and this does relate, I think, to Gail's question as well, is whether you have looked at, or in your research, have you found any studies that look at the outcomes of FM or IM that suggest that those provide realistic estimates of ability to pay, and could that really be the problem? Again, this really fits in, following up on Gail's question, are the numbers being provided realistic? Does it really show a family's ability to pay? And of course, I see Bernie Picala is still here, and I started getting my lesson in ability to pay and why we use institutional methodology all those years ago at Boston College, thanks to Bernie. So I'm glad he's here to hear it, and maybe Bernie has some other thoughts on this as well. But let me turn it over to you first, Professor.
Yeah, sure.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Sure. So, I mean, there definitely is research that's been conducted. Sarah Goldrick Robb is the one who's done the most work on this, about whether or not needs are being met for low-income students. And, you know, you hear the stories about kids who, you know, during breaks don't have enough food to eat, and like don't have the, you know, there's you know, anecdotal evidence fits with the research that, you know, EFC probably is missing a little bit. This is sort of my answer to Gail. That's probably missing. I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about it, if you take a step back, right, like trying to measure, you know, you're counting somebody else's money and figuring out how much they can actually afford to pay is not a simple task, right? And there's never going to be a right answer with that. The number of judgment calls that take place along the way to even get at a formula for doing that. I mean, in some sense, it's a Herculean task trying to actually nail the right answer. And we do the best that we can. It's not perfect. It's probably never going to be perfect. In terms of, we can still tinker. The one thing which I do want to say, though, is that, you know, I think in the financial aid world and discussions about financial aid policy, there's a lot of attention spent on what are, from my graphs, what's on the x-axis, the EFC, and how do we best measure the EFC? I would argue that that's interesting, but really what I care about is what happens when you go up to the net price. Because that's what they're paying is the net price. And if you don't get the EFC exactly right, but then you're going to tack on an extra $5,000 anyways because you don't meet full need, you're really in the gap, right? So like at the end of the day, we need to get people a lot closer to what we think of as the right measure of ability to pay. The IM-FM thing, you know, I've done a lot of work, believe me, a lot of work comparing IM and FM. For families that are big, that have standard finances, you get very similar answers between the two. I mean, many of you likely know that from comparing, you know, internally student to student, the IM and FM estimates that you get if you're an IM school. It's in the outliers. It's in the people that, you know, who live in Boston, who, you know, have a modest house that's $700,000. You know, that's going to have a much bigger impact in IM, obviously, than it is in FM. And so those are the sorts of, you know, that's where you get big differences. But for you know, certainly for low income households where there's not a lot of assets, you're not going to get a very different estimate. So like I said, I think that what I want to change the focus on a little bit is nailing the exact EFC and thinking about, well, what's that family really going to have to pay, the net price.
Got it. Got it. Good thoughts, sir. All right. Maylene, you are up next. If you're able to come off mute, there you go.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. And my question, I'm not sure if it's a bit too broad for the topic that you were discussing today, but I feel like I've heard, not necessarily from people who work within financial aid, but this idea that if we increase financial aid like the Pell Grant or state aid, that schools in response are going to increase their costs in response to increased financial aid. And I was just wondering if that was something that I was just curious what the, you know, an economics perspective would be on that, and if that's something that came up in your research, and if you had kind of any commentary on that.
Sure. Economists worry about stuff like that's basically why economists live, is to think about issues like that. You know, basically from an economics perspective, like once you provide someone with an incentive, we want to know, like, is it being taken up? The interesting thing about that is just because you provide someone with an incentive doesn't mean they respond to that incentive. And so a lot of what we do in our work is to try to estimate how responsive are people to the incentives we provide them. Colleges definitely have an incentive to increase their cost of attendance to steal, quote unquote, those higher Pell Grant funds. And when people make those arguments, it's not an illogical argument. But we also have data on how schools respond when that happens. And there's been a lot of research done on that as well. There is a little bit of evidence that indicates that schools respond a little in that dimension, but like on the order of 10%. So, you know, if you increase the Pell Grant by $1,000, maybe schools increase their cost of attendance by $100, and that students get 90% of that advantage. Oftentimes people aren't convinced with evidence like that. And that's why I'm saying, like, if you give schools enough money with the Pell Grant that they can afford to meet full need, and then you impose that they meet full need, that would make it impossible for the schools to steal that money in that way. And so I think that's a way to sort of bring along the opposition on that regard. So I think that restriction, like if you get an additional $7,000 in Pell Grant on top of the current level, to accept the money, you have to meet full need. The school should be willing to take it because they can afford to do that. And that prevents the problem and should solve, resolve that dilemma.
Good thought. Professor, I want to be respectful of your time, especially on this happy occasion for you. We have two more questions. Is that okay for you? You good to field those? Great. Thank you very much. Kathy, then I'm going to turn it over to you if you're able to come off mute.
Okay.
There you go.
Off. Yeah, I'm Kathy Osmond. I'm retired from financial aid, and I'm probably the oldest person on this telephone call. And referencing some of the comments that Gail was making about all of the other expenses that these students face and the economic situation they're in, I remember a time when the College Board, and this goes way back, used to actually compute a negative parental contribution. And I think they capped the negative at -1,000, but this was, probably back in, it was before FM split off. So it was quite a while ago, but that might be, that might be one option that, and I brought this up before, but nobody seems to really kind of take it up as something that could be done. But I think it would be very instructive if people could see, not only can these people afford to contribute zero, they actually have so much need that they should be subsidized. And I know that for political reasons, that's a difficult thing perhaps to sell, because the federal government doesn't want to know that there are contributions less than zero. But it's always seemed to me that it would be something that the College Board might factor in at some, and it would be very interesting.
Yeah, so there might be people who know the details of this better than I do, but I'm fairly confident that the recent FAFSA simplification allows for that in FM, allows for a negative EFC. It's not clear how, Gail Holt, it's not going to be EFC anymore either. It's going to be the Student Aid Index, SAI, and it will allow for a negative student contribution, or negative family contribution.
Right.
Again, also some of you may know the details of this more than I do, but like IM hasn't really responded in detail with how what changes IM, what changes will take place in IM in response to the FM changes, because those don't go into effect for another 1.5 years or something anyway. So there's time for all that. Yeah. So your idea, I think, like someone heard you.
No, it just so you know, they're giving us a negative SAI, but it's not a negative in impacting the cost of attendance. And for a cost of attendance and overwards, it's just going to be treated as zero. The basic information that they provided us, it is to allow schools to prioritize their funds to the neediest, because they're thinking that this will expand the Pels.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Kathy, and thanks for joining us. Hope you're enjoying the retirement there, and hopefully someplace warmer than where we are. We have one last question for you, Professor. This is from David Jenny, and thanks so much for the question, sir. He's interested in your use of the term maximum cost and looking for you to talk a little bit more about that. He's wondering about your thoughts on how to message that without alienating those who will be paying that maximum amount. So I hope that makes sense. If not, I'll let David clarify it, but I think I'm following. So Professor, if you are, there's your last question for the day, and thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. Language matters. And when you use the term, so I haven't, like I said, I have an opinion piece that I'm working on exactly this topic that should be coming out soon in the Chronicle. But, language matters. And when you call something the cost of attendance, it sounds like that's the number. And we use it because the federal government requires us to use it. I mean, basically the Higher Education Act, for calculating Pell eligibility requires a calculation of the cost of attendance. You're required to post it, publicize it, whatever, which obviously means these days putting it on your website. And that's the law, but I think it'd still probably satisfy the law if you put the maximum in front of it. Like at the end of the day, I don't think that high income students that are paying the full price are surprised that there's people paying less than that, because basically almost everybody pays less than that. Like I said, 87% of students are paying less than the cost of attendance. And so if you are paying that, it must stick out to you that that's the case. And to the extent that the 13% might be a little bit confused, the 87% are very confused. And at the end of the day, those are the students who are looking at a college of $25,000 at the Salem State. My institution charges $80,000. And if that's the only number that I mean, if you're making $37,000, like my first slide, you can't pay $25,000, and you certainly can't pay $80,000. At least if you label that number with a maximum, people might think like, well, what does that mean, maximum? Maybe that's not what I would have to pay. Like at the end of the day, a lot of, the first step in this process just has to be eliminating that association of these numbers that are extremely high with what students are actually going to have to pay. Most of the time, they're not. And we have to be able to get, like, if the only goal we can accomplish is to get people off of the sticker price, we will have accomplished something. The fact that, we still can argue about whether the pricing is affordable. It doesn't matter if it's, the net price is 10,000 or 14,000, 25 or 30 or 80 still is way more than that. And they're certainly not going to respond appropriately to those numbers.
Well, very good. I didn't see a follow-up from David on that, so I'm assuming that answered the question. And just to put in a plug for you, since you didn't, and I appreciate that, but we certainly should, I'm going to throw a link to your book there in the chat. And of course, that'll be out again in April. And just based on today's presentation, I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic read. And one more time, I will make sure everyone knows that you may want to look for that Brookings Institution piece on the economic case for doubling Pell Grants from Professor Levine here. I'm going to thank him one more time for joining us. Pleasure to get to know you a little bit, sir. We'll certainly keep in touch, and I'd love to have you again. He threatened to put a big Red Sox banner up behind him if I'm ever involved in another session. So we may want someone else moderating that call, but really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to my good friend and colleague here, Dan Rossi, to close us out. And I'll just quickly thank all my colleagues here from the Massachusetts Association of Student Financial Aid Advisors Financial Wellness Committee. I think I got all that right. For all of you who are on the call, thanks for all your hard work and all you do. Dan, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. That was great. And I feel like there's just so much that we can dig into there. And one thing that I was really struck by, I was thinking about the financial aid funnel, or just like the information. And one of the big pieces of our committee, the Financial Wellness Education Committee, is thinking about how this is all communicated to students and how they receive it and how they're learning it. I think about verification. They talk about the concept of they're going back to having verification for 22, 23, and how that can be so limiting, and just all these aspects that I'm just excited to continue these types of conversations. And so thanks again. Also, we have our next session on 3/23. I put it in the chat. That's at 1 o'clock, looking beyond the Herf Cliff. And we'll have some other sessions. We are hoping to do one with Zach Taylor. Some of you have seen him in the past, about just different ways of communicating financial issues to your students. And we're looking at doing that in April. So hopefully some exciting stuff coming up, and thanks again for coming out.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.